In this video, I would like to briefly explain the eras in bodybuilding. I often refer to the bronze and silver eras in my videos, but what do these terms actually mean? And what was special about each era? Well, let's get into it. The origins of bodybuilding as we know it can be traced back to the late 1800s. During this time, bodybuilding as a sport did not quite exist yet. But what we did have was strongmen. The likes of Arthur Saxon, Louis Cyr, George Hackenschmidt, Professor Attila, Apollon, and many more had impressive muscles, but their training was purely focused on performance. Their goal was usually to entertain the crowds with amazing displays of strength. These men weren't bodybuilders. However, we know that even at the time, there was an appreciation for their physiques. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been flexing their biceps when they posed for photos. But it really wasn't until Eugene Sandow came along that people started training with the specific intention of making their physiques look a certain way. I covered this in my previous video, but it was here at the very end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s where bodybuilding as a standalone sport was born. This is the Bronze Era, and it lasted until the 1930s. In my opinion, some of the best physiques to come out of this era are, of course, Eugene Sandow himself, Bobby Pandour, Began Raj, and Billy Ralph. The bodybuilders in the Bronze Era were 100% natural, as steroids had not been invented yet. Even so, you have people trying to say that they weren't natural because they ate animal testicles, which is just a ridiculous argument, guys. You cannot imagine the amount of testicles one would need to eat to get any meaningful amount of testosterone. And even then, your body is not actually able to use it because it gets inactivated by your liver. I know it's a hard pill to swallow for those of you that constantly whine about people being on steroids over 100 years ago, but the fact is that these guys look the way they did because they put a lot of effort and consistency into their training. Even though they didn't have much knowledge at the time, they still tried their best and got some pretty decent results. From the 1930s, we start to move into the Silver Era. This is where bodybuilding would really begin to mature as a sport. Gyms were opening up all over the place, so many more people were beginning to have access to equipment. The world-famous Muscle Beach was opened in 1934 in California, and in 1939 we had the first Mr. America competition. It is here where we would truly start to see fully developed physiques. No longer did we have the relatively small chests and legs of the Bronze Era. John Grimmick, Marvin Eder, Steve Reeves, George Eiferman, and many more would show us what was possible when every muscle group was trained correctly. It is also here where the V-taper shape would become the standard, with the wide shoulders, huge lats, and tiny waists. The Silver Era would last until the 50s, and this is more controversial, but it is my opinion that the bodybuilders in this era were still natural. I will make a full video on the history of steroids, but from the research I've done, I believe that bodybuilders really only started using steroids in the late 50s and early 60s. Even though testosterone was first synthesized in 1935, it was difficult to produce, extremely expensive, not available to the general public, and also not very well understood. It wasn't until the Russian Olympic weightlifting team started using testosterone in 1954, and especially once Dianabol was released in 1958, that bodybuilders started getting their hands on steroids. Now again, that is just my opinion and you're welcome to disagree with me. But I do believe that bodybuilders from the early 50s and before were still natural. With Dianabol coming on the scene, we are quickly thrust into the golden era of bodybuilding. At this point, bodybuilders are suddenly no longer constrained by the limits of natural human physiology. With these newly available chemical enhancements, bodybuilders were able to push their physiques to a level which simply was not possible before. To be honest, this is pretty much where my personal interest in bodybuilding history ends. With me being a natural lifter, I do not feel like I can identify with or draw inspiration from the golden era. I am interested in natural bodybuilding, and what started to happen in the golden era was a completely new and separate sport. However, that's just my opinion, and we will of course still cover it in this video. So the golden era began in the late 50s and early 60s. The physiques during this time still had a somewhat similar shape to the silver era, only much bigger overall. These bodybuilders had a solid 20 or 30 pounds on the silver era guys, while also being leaner at the same time. I believe this era is looked back on so fondly because the bodybuilders during this time had just begun to push the limits in terms of size. Yet were still keeping a very aesthetic and not too shredded look. It certainly was not natural, but it still looked human and was easier to resonate with. In 1965, the first Mr. Olympia was held, and winning this competition quickly became the pinnacle of the sport. The success of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the movie Pumping Iron helped bodybuilding go mainstream. But of course, there is a giant list of legendary figures from this era, like Larry Scott, Franco Columbu, Bill Pearl, Frank Zane, Sergio Oliva, Mike Menser, Danny Padilla, Serge Nubret, Tom Platz, and very many more. During the 80s, bodybuilding, general fitness, and supplements would all become massive global industries. The golden era would continue until the end of the 80s, but then everything would change once again. In the beginning of the 90s, this man, Dorian Yates, with his absolutely freakish size, would kick off the mass monster era of bodybuilding. At this point, the aesthetics and proportions we enjoyed during the silver and golden eras were sort of thrown out the window. Bodybuilders, above all else, had to be massive. This is where we would begin to see the true limits of what an enhanced human body was capable of in terms of size. With the invention of new, more powerful drugs and some extremely motivated and perhaps careless users. Paul Dillette, Marcus Rule, Jay Cutler, Ronnie Coleman, and others were able to achieve physiques so freaky that honestly they just no longer looked like human beings. Some of these guys competed at over 300 pounds of absolutely shredded muscle. This is where bodybuilding loses me completely. While I will admit that there is a little bit of curiosity in terms of seeing just how big someone is able to get, I do not find these physiques to be aesthetically appealing in any way. I'm sure people will disagree with this, but personally, when I see a mass monster, all I can think is that I'm looking at a chemistry experiment. An experiment to see just how much drugs someone is able to pump into themselves without dropping dead on the spot. It's no longer bodybuilding in my eyes. It's just reckless and dangerous. I really have no interest in participating or supporting a sport where the prerequisite is to put your life on the line by using massive amounts of deadly drugs. Unfortunately, the mass monster era continues to this day, with the current Mr. Olympia being 300-pound Big Ramy. I will admit it makes me quite sad to see bodybuilding continuing in this direction. But I am very thankful for all the information and photographs we have from the silver and bronze eras, which is what I will continue to highlight and discuss on this channel. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this explanation of the different eras in bodybuilding, along with some of my personal commentary and opinions, of course. For more Bronze and Silver era videos, make sure to subscribe to the channel.